In the esoteric philosophy, there's this principle that says that always the greater will be inclusive of the lesser, but not the other way around. A good example of that would be just in the human experience. The soul consciousness in you, it actually has, it includes the consciousness of the personality and has an influence on the personality. So it's inclusive of personality consciousness. But personality consciousness is not inclusive of soul consciousness. And that's a very fundamental principle in a lot of things, and particularly if we looked at this idea of what is an exoteric versus an esoteric approach to looking at life. Exoteric is more restrictive. Esoteric is broader and subtler and wiser and has more fundamental truths than the exoteric. So esotericism is inclusive of exotericism, but not the other way around. I've already said a lot about the esoteric. It's the deeper, subtler, the truths that are not so obvious and hidden. Exoteric is a word that has much to do with the outer garment of the esoteric. Exoteric is much more related to what we see in the world. Religions, all religions, in terms of how they present themselves in the world, are largely exoteric. That is to say, they have externalized and given form and dogma and precepts that are fundamental to their theologies. They define a moral code. They establish right behavior. They lay out a specific agenda. Those are exoteric patterns. They represent the form of truth, whereas an esotericist is much more interested in sensing the subtle truths that are more intuitive but are behind the scenes. Exoteric, you might say, is a concretization of the esoteric, but always with that concretization comes restriction and diminishment. So exoteric theology is, although it often thinks it has the truth, actually it has a very narrow, reduced, attenuated expression of the truth, and that if you penetrate beyond the exoteric principles, you will find the deeper esoteric ideas that represent a wider truth.
Human beings have all different types of capability. You know, if you believe in the idea of cyclic rebirth, we develop from an early stage of relative inability to understand to a great brilliance. So when the ageless wisdom is presented, it's presented for many. And there are many levels of understanding. There's an exoteric method of understanding. In India, we call it the Puranas. And it's put in pictorial language, and the gods and goddesses are there, and the people of less reincarnational experience can grasp something of the essence through those stories, through those allegories, etc. The Christ, he spoke in allegories to the people, but he said, you know, to you, to his disciples, to you, I speak of the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. Okay, here are the Puranas, here are the Upanishads. Upanishads are conveying the same truth, but they are deeply, deeply philosophical and meant for people who have more reincarnational experience and can understand them. So there's always a way into the ageless wisdom, and it is presented in ways that different strata of intelligence can understand. You know, sometimes, well, all men are created equal. They are indeed. All men are created equal in one respect. As monads, as spirits, they are completely equal. Okay. But in terms of their experience in time and space, there is great variation. So let's not try to teach calculus to a 4-year-old. You know, we have to learn how to teach the inner essence of things to those who can appreciate it, and to those who are in a way younger in their experience, we have to have a more exoteric presentation. And Madame Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine is wonderful in how she describes the exoteric and the esoteric presentations of the ageless wisdom. Both are necessary.
To further highlight the Indian discussion of exoteric versus esoteric, we have the work of Patanjali, who was the great mystic of India, who is said to be the founder of all the yoga systems. And the sutras of Patanjali are really fundamentally some of the most esoteric material on the planet. And yet, mainstream Hindus know little about it or have any kind of encouragement to inquire into it. So that's an example of it. You can also see this dynamic playing in Western theologies too. For instance, you have Christianity, and you have all of these various denominations of Christianity and these different ways of framing the Christian doctrine, but it is still doctrine. Whereas there are branches within Christianity that are far more mystical and far less encumbered by their doctrine, the doctrine of Christianity. The Gnostic Gospels are interesting because those are Gospels that weren't even discovered until 1948 in the Egyptian desert, and those Gospels have a whole different kind of way of explaining the life of Jesus and the whole Christian dispensation. And those Gospels have many more esoteric principles in them. One being that all of the Gnostic Gospels put responsibility for your spiritual development on yourself, and that it's through your own inner journey and your own gnosis that you will find your relationship to the divine. While in Christianity, the exoteric version of Christianity, which is the masked version, that version is very much oriented toward following the church leadership, the following the priesthood as they are the authorities. But in the Gnostics, you are your own authority, and that's a very fundamental principle in any branch of esotericism.
One of the main differences that you find between the approaches to religious approach versus the approach that we assign to the ageless wisdom or the esoteric traditions is the emphasis on self-responsibility. Very often, the normal approach to religious life is that we are more or less told the proper avenues to think, to behave, and then it's a matter of belief. That because we believe sufficiently, that's something that is sufficient. The very marked difference is that when we find ourselves involved with this ageless wisdom approach, we become directly responsible for our own unfoldment. You become the judge, the jury, the prosecutor, and the one who's going to prison if you fail. So that's the way, it's a very distinct difference. So there's nobody to blame, probably many people to thank, but ultimately the responsibility for our unfoldment rests with us. And that's something that's both liberating and it's also challenging, because what it requires is that we develop through self-induced and self-devised methods, we develop an approach to this process of unfoldment.
Blavatsky, in The Secret Doctrine, was very broad in her presentation of different religions and philosophies. But she tended to call the usual religions and their usual exoteric presentation unphilosophical. From her, this was not a compliment. She felt that the presentation to humanity by the ordinary religions did not take them deep enough and was inconsistent in its or their principles. The ageless wisdom is a consistent presentation of a philosophy that covers all aspects of life. It transcends the ego, lower ego. And so many of the religions of today offer incentives to the lower ego. You as a lower ego will be saved, you'll spend time in paradise forever, you will be saved, others will not, etc., etc. So it views man as the lower encapsulated identity. The ageless wisdom begins with foundational principles of the one, or of the zero, and through the process of emanation, which is found in Buddhism and Gnosticism and also in the modern presentation of the wisdom, all things come out of the one, and all things are related, and all things are the one, and you are not allowed the easy escape of thinking of yourself as a unique, definite, isolated individual who will forever be that way. So the lesser presentations through the ordinary religions deal with the salvation of the individual ego, or the progress of the individual ego, and they're perfectly fine for what we might call the path of probation, where we all think of ourselves as a certain thing who is in the process of progress. The ageless wisdom, on the other hand, begins to expand the notion of identity until we drop one false identity after another and begin to realize that the macrocosmic whole is all there is, and we are that. So on the path of the ageless wisdom, identity changes constantly. On the earlier paths, as presented by normal religions, we still indulge the fallacy of thinking of ourselves as a limited ego, a limited identity.
Within the Jewish system, there is an exoteric and an esoteric expression as well. The exoteric would be the Torah, which is the foundation of the whole mainstream Jewish mindset. But then there's the subtler, more esoteric, Kabbalistic approach. And this, when you study the Kabbalah, you see the deeper esoteric principles, because many of those principles are going to be found in other religions as well. And the tree of life, which is a fundamental principle or model used in the Kabbalistic thinking, is very, very aligned with the fundamental esoterics found in Hinduism and in the Christian esoteric approach as well. So that's another way of understanding esoteric versus exoteric. Esoteric systems of thought will be recognized underlying many theologies. Exoteric systems of thought are exclusive to a theology. You have the same thing in Islam. You have the typical Islamic orientation that is very much exoteric, and then you have some of the elements of Sufism that is much more esoteric.
The ageless wisdom appeals to the mind, and especially the philosophical mind. And so many religious presentations today appeal to the frustrated emotional nature, which desires and desires and is not satisfied, and wants some kind of compliance in heaven, in paradise, somewhere else, in a dualistic manner, compliance so that those desires can be satisfied. The ageless wisdom begins with the will. It begins with what we essentially are, and then ramifies out into all kinds of specificity, and then returns to the oneness. This is the great breadth of the ageless wisdom. So many religions, if you tell them that you are not you are not who you think you are, they'll think that you are violating a deep principle of their identity. The ageless wisdom comes along and shatters that notion of false lower ego identity and gives you expansiveness until you become the entire universe. It sounds like a radical thing to say, but if you follow it to its source, you become everything.